let's switch gear a bit. Looking at your book, obviously you've written a great story. People that read it enjoy it, but just curious, being a first-time author, one part is also, one part is obviously writing the story and that you're happy with the result. How hard has it been to figure out the distribution? Because obviously this is a niche theme. So how has that been, trying to think about distribution? And I guess there are many lessons there and still lessons to be learned because it's fairly new, the book.
No, it's a great question, actually, because it's something that it has no great answer. Because I wrestled with this and then for several years in the process, but even before writing it and researching it. So for me, it's the issue that all industries, all jobs have a tendency to be a little bit inbred. We develop jargon to kind of keep outsiders at bay. We almost deliberately make some things seem more complicated and difficult and off-putting than it really needs to be. Finance is certainly one of those areas. It is just inherently fairly complex. So people are kind of almost on purpose, but certainly also inadvertently kept at arm's length. They don't have an understanding. They don't want to understand. So I think one of the most important things for me as a financial journalist as well is, I do write for the people that read at the FT. I write for my sources, as we say sometimes. But it's also important that when there is something genuinely important, that you try to write it for other people. So when I was at Bloomberg News, I can't remember if it's Mike Bloomberg, the founder of the company, or Matt Winkler, who was his first Titanic editor-in-chief, who had an aunt called Agatha. And Agatha was apparently very, very, very smart and very curious, but knew nothing about finance or economics. And the whole motto of Bloomberg was that we were writing for Aunt Agatha. So even at Bloomberg, the theoretical reader who we should always have in mind is somebody who's smart and curious. So don't talk down to them. Don't pretend that they're idiots, but don't expect that they know anything about what you're writing about. And I think that's a pretty good mental model and what I've tried to have with this book, in that clearly it is going to be way more, resonate more with certainly anybody in finance, but I was hoping it would also resonate with people in the wider business community, because it's just, I think, a really good business story about a new technology, the index fund, that was spat upon in its first years, but slowly took over and changed the world. Because the index fund is essentially just a new technology. So I think it's a broad-based technology story, and the corporate infighting and the mergers and the fights, and the deal making that took to kind of push it at the center of the world, the financial world, I think is interesting. And, I wanted my parents to be able to read it and not give up. So that was also, one of my aims.
What's the most constructive feedback you have received so far? I saw one comment that maybe isn't constructive, more like a comment that they felt it was a bit US centric versus maybe the UK or whatever. But obviously that's sort of a decision you have to make as an author. But have you received any constructive feedback that you've actually found really valuable?
Yes. I received that right at the beginning of the process, and I'll mention the US centrism. Yes, so there's lots of criticism that sometimes I agree with it. So I'll take the stuff that I don't agree with. That it's US centric, yes, but fundamentally, this was an invention that was born and grew up and has gone the furthest in the US. So I did think about having more international perspectives, but it would have felt like you were shoehorning things just so they would feel not ignored, essentially. But they weren't essential to the story. So actually, I don't regret that, because it would have been made it a messier, a harder to read book with just more characters and more names to keep on top of. The stuff that I think has been interesting, and people haven't mentioned that much, but bond in index funds and bond ETFs. I do have a bit of mention on how they can kind of break bad in the later chapters, but I think that is so radically interesting and probably potentially as big, if not even bigger, change than to the equity market, to the fixed income market structure than equity ETFs and index funds were. I would have actually quite have liked to have had an entire bond chapter on the development of those. The history of indexes as well, the index providers, MSCI, S&P Dow Jones, FTSE Russell, lots of others in the bond land. I have written about that interspersed through the book, but that probably would have could have arguably deserved its own chapter or two. But the best advice, and one I'll give anybody who's listening, who ever wants to write a book, I was having drinks, I think a couple of days after I'd gotten the book contract, and I was glowing, sort of almost pregnant with expectation for my amazing book. And all my colleagues were being super nice and saying congratulations. And we're at this journalistic sort of events do. And there was a journalist at The Economist, who's a friend of a friend, kind of ambled over, and he'd written several very successful books. And he said, look, Robin, I'm just going to give you one piece of advice, because everybody's going to tell you before and afterwards that your book is amazing. And even the criticism, they're going to like soften. And afterwards, you're going to be on cloud nine and, you know, enjoy that. But the best advice I got that I'm now passing on to you is this: you only write a first book once, so don't fuck it up. And this was essentially his message, that, you know, it's just work hard at it. It has a permanence that is beyond what you have in journalism. And writing a book is a radically different type and style of writing a newspaper article. So I write lots of long form stuff for the FT, but even that's very different style from writing a news story. So I have colleagues, and I know journalists who are just phenomenal news journalists. But if you ask them to write a long form feature, they'd struggle. And vice versa. Lots of beautiful feature writers would just collapse if they had to actually produce a 400-word news story or even a book. So I actually thought that was really horrific but important advice that made me a little bit paranoid and maybe increase my effort a little bit more through the entire process.